make sure that people don't miss what's occurring, which is, if you remember months ago, I gave a class on Rosa Luxemburg and the question of the mass strike. And that is what you have with Occupy Wall Street. And that is what you had in 1989, for people who remember. First, you had the Tiananmen Square massacre. And then you had all these independence movements in Eastern Europe. People might remember in, I think it was Lithuania, they had a symphony orchestra that came out and was playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, among other things. This was before the Berlin Wall came down. And then what occurred in East Berlin was you had been having actually for a year candlelight vigils on Monday nights. And the motto of this movement was Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. It was not profound. I mean, beyond that, which is a profound idea, it wasn't complicated. They didn't have a list of demands. But because of the risk to life and limb in standing up against a dictatorial state where it was known that the tanks could be brought in to roll over people at any moment, this took a profound significance, and people were elevated, and people were in the mind of what Shelley discusses in his Defense of Poetry. Now, what occurred is that Lyndon LaRouche was in prison. Bush Sr. and Maggie Thatcher were running the show. They put Germany under absolutely excruciating pressure to give up its sovereignty and launch the euro. And this movement did not have a solution. So what happened, as we discussed it, is you had a great opportunity which was missed. Now what Skye and Lynn are taking up is the situation today where, because of 40 plus years of cultural backwardness and the assassinations of both Kennedys and the cover-up and the Vietnam War, you have now in the United States a mass strike, and anyone who's been there, a number of people in this room I know now have been over there talking to the people at Occupy Wall Street. And what you see is there's an incredible openness. People do have a profound sense. People were prepared if they were going to clean Zuccotti Park, and the reason they didn't clean Zuccotti Park is because people were prepared to link arms and sit there and get maced or whatever else. So there's a dynamic to this which is profound, and similar to what happened in 1989, where the theme was Wir sind das Volk. Now the theme is we are the 99%. That the reason they're all inclusive, and the reason why so far various attempts to provoke really nasty showdowns with the police is because people in this group are saying, no, the police are part of the 99%. The police are being attacked for having pension funds. So they know that it's an inclusive movement. But because of the depravity of the culture, because of their belief in environmentalism, and the idea that the world is overpopulated, they will fail. They are not in a position to actually bring about the change which they desire. And I think partly from the standpoint, people will see on the website, there's a really, and it's here, a leaflet by Skye Shields written in consultation with Mr. LaRouche. We're doing a series of educational leaflets for the revolution with video materials so that we can bring to these people who are looking for profound ideas that challenge, so that maybe they can give up some of these crazy culturally induced axioms that will doom them to failure and work with us to do something which is successful. But also, these are the axioms that we're dealing with in the Congress. And these are the axioms that you're dealing with your neighbors. How many people have you spoken with who think environmentalism is a bad thing. People accept this. They accept the idea of overpopulation. They accept the idea that the New Jersey Energy Master Plan, all the hearings were on conservation. Cut back. Don't use as much. Don't eat as much. Don't use as much electricity. Next, they'll tell us don't bathe as much. You know, and don't stand next to each other. That'll be a way of encouraging depopulation. Everybody will stink, so you don't want to be around anybody. I mean, that's a dark age. And I wanted to just say that because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a little bit of LaRouche's latest paper, which is an extremely profound, challenging document. It references everything I ever read since I joined this movement, and it references plenty of things that I never read since I joined this movement. So what I'm going to do is not going to by any means be conclusive, but hopefully will inspire everybody here to do some work and to dig into heavy ideas. And I wanted to just go back a little bit to what Scott was raising about this coup. Because actually I think it's useful to reflect a couple of things. One, Bush Sr. was president when the Berlin Wall came down. Prior to that, when Ronald Reagan was president and LaRouche was the architect of the Strategic Defense Initiative, Bush Sr. was vice president. And one of the things that he did as vice president, people in here may remember something called Iran-Contra. And there was a war in Nicaragua, and LaRouche was given an offer, basically, that he should get involved in this thing, take a side. And he said, no way, this is not about fighting communism. You're getting weapons from communists in exchange for drugs from people fighting, you know, forget it. He said, I'm not going to be involved. And they said, okay, we'll silence you. You're not going to be allowed to be a mainstream presidential candidate if you won't support this operation. The Congress did not agree with the war. So what happened was, as vice president, George H.W. Bush, got a number of executive orders passed whereby a secret war could be financed by drug money outside of the Congress approving it. This was Iran-Contra. This was one of the first steps. And when they put Mr. LaRouche on trial in the 80s, the Boston trial, I was a student in Boston at the time, and what happened was the trial ended in a mistrial because it turned out there was a document in Ollie North's safe, Ollie North of Iran-Contra fame, Ollie North, who was knowingly flying massive amounts of cocaine into the United States to fund this operation. And the document said, our man here has the info on LaRouche. And the judge ordered that we could then search everyone involved in Iran-Contra, because our point in the Boston trial, what the media said was the Boston trial was about credit card fraud. Many people here have heard this, that we allegedly, our fundraisers were putting unauthorized charges on people's credit cards. We said this is a government witch hunt to silence a political movement, and lo and behold, we get this document in Ollie North's safe saying our man here has the info against LaRouche. And the judge then ordered that George Bush Sr., then vice president, that his files were to be searched because there did seem to be evidence that there was indeed a government witch hunt against LaRouche. And as soon as the judge gave the order to search the files of George Bush Sr., guess what happened? They ended the case. They declared a mistrial. And the pretext was that the they were going to declare a mistrial and shut it all down. And this was so outrageous that the jury, and you can imagine a jury, to find a jury that did not know Lyndon LaRouche, you had to have a bunch of not very political people. The jury was so angry that they went out and held a press conference saying that had the trial continued, they would have acquitted LaRouche of all the charges, that it was clear to them that this was a politically motivated case. So I bring that up because LaRouche and this movement has a record. We are seen as the #1 obstacle to this country going fascist. And everyone here should bear that in mind and should think about why Lynn is now trying to get through these very heavy, very difficult and complex ideas. Now, one thing also I just meant to mention on this background of Cheney's role, because as people know, Cheney came in as defense secretary under Bush Sr., and explicitly what he did was he got paid, I forget how much it was, or he arranged a contract for Halliburton to do a study on whether Halliburton could actually replace huge sections of the U.S. Army. This is all in the Children of Satan book. And we actually did get rid of 6 full divisions of the Army. That was Cheney's doing, so that they could be replaced by, in effect, mercenaries, by private contractors whose employees are not subject to the same laws and regulations as people who are officially in the U.S. military. So what Obama is doing now, and the fact that Dick Cheney has come out publicly endorsing Obama's assassination of 2 U.S. citizens, and now I guess they did another drone attack and killed al-Awlaki's son and a bunch of other people. So, I mean, this is a big escalation, and they are using drones over the U.S. for spying so far. But the question here is, where is the line? If you're saying that you can assassinate American citizens overseas because of an alleged link to Al-Qaeda, which you never have to disclose in court, and all the evidence is secret, where's the line between that and what we do in the United States? And it's definitely worth thinking about in terms of what's happening with the mass strike and potential responses to the mass strike. And as I said, I thought it was a major victory this week that they had to back off on cleaning the park, that they decided it wouldn't be expedient to have an ugly showdown with the occupiers who were not prepared to move and who did go ahead and do their own cleaning of the park as well. There was some sort of a legal agreement that they would do that. Anyway, so the thing I wanted to start with is this quote. You can see this. I really like this. You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him 250,000 miles out and say, "Look at that, you son of a bitch." So this was an interview given by Edgar Mitchell, who was an Apollo 14 astronaut, to People magazine in April of 1974, which is great, all right, it's great. So you think about that. Think about your perspective. Think about what we're saying about the new Trans-Pacific Partnership. Doesn't it look like the obvious thing if you imagine looking at the Earth from the moon? Isn't it the obvious thing that these vast areas with vast potential should be developed, like Siberia, like the Arctic? And any sane human being taken off the planet and plopped into outer space, looking back with that kind of perspective, would see that that's has a much greater priority than some silly war in Afghanistan or a bailout of Goldman Sachs or all of the other ridiculous things that we're fighting about. So now what we're going to do is go on to a few sections from Mr. LaRouche's paper. So he says, this is near the beginning, therefore, I restate what I have said above. Our role presently must be recognized in the immediate challenge of defeating a British Empire-led threat to the continued existence of our United States Republic. It is, in fact, a present threat by the British Empire to the existence of our human species. The defeat of that British threat to civilization is now still the crucial strategic mission before this planet as a whole. And if you think back to the presentations of the last couple weeks, Bob's presentation on Sun Yat-sen, and then the discussion of Leibniz. Remember, Leibniz was saying that Europe was really screwed up, right? They had just had this really long religious war. They had the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Thank God for that. It was the only sane thing, which was that states should interact with each other based on the interest of the other. No retribution and so on. And were it not for that, Europe would have really been destroyed. But regardless, they had that. They still had this totally hierarchical system where everything was by bloodline. Everything was who you related to. You couldn't have a career other than what your father had. You couldn't marry into certain families. It was as if human beings were animals. And Leibniz was peeved because the Christians in Europe were saying that the Chinese were barbarians. And he went to China, and studied the Chinese. He studied Confucius and found very profound universal principles of universal goodness. And he said, here you are, this is a culture which is thousands of years old, older than your culture, and you're saying these people are barbarians. I think we should have a whole bunch of Chinese people come over here and civilize Europe. And that's what Leibniz was proposing, which I don't think was entirely in jest. Okay, so what you have in the British Empire, what is that? That's the leftover legacy of the Roman Empire, which moved through Rome, Byzantium, Venice, up into the Netherlands. It's the oligarchical virus, where the idea is that man is a beast, and therefore a tiny percentage of human beings have the right to rule over and enslave the vast majority of everyone else, right? So that's what the British Empire is. And right now, unfortunately, for the reasons that some of what I just went through, people aren't terribly clear right now on what it means to be human anymore, which is one of the first things you're going to have to address if we're actually going to save civilization. So that's what LaRouche says. He says, our subject here is the true nature of the human mind. The lower three of four that are fairly represented by the following array of their faults. Number one, a mistaken faith in sense certainty, i.e., if I can see it, I believe it. If I can hold it in my hand, if I can touch it, smell it, that's true. That's reality, and you know reality because it's sensuous, and you can perceive it using your five senses. Okay. Number two, a mistaken belief in the existence of space. The idea that they still teach us in physics that basically our universe is inside this big empty box, and there's a few things in the box. There's some stars, there's some planets, and this number two comes out of number one, because if you only believe in what we can perceive with our senses, then there's a whole lot that's going on in so-called space that we don't have a clue about what's happening. I mean, just take, for example, the electromagnetic field. Birds, fish, navigate using a domain of sense which human beings are not all that sensitive to. So there's something going on that we cannot see, smell, touch, hear, or taste, which determines how birds know how to fly south in the winter. Now, so if you would only go by your senses, well, you would say, well, obviously there's nothing else in here. It's our physical bodies, the projector, the chair, and where the chair ends, empty space begins. And maybe there's air, okay, maybe there's something we're doing when we inhale, so there's some oxygen or something. But once you get out of our atmosphere, then there's really nothing. And of course, what you discover is that actually nothing could be further from the truth. And not only that, but this so-called space also has a geometry to it. It has a shape to it. And the shape also is hard to imagine because it's probably not simple Euclidean space, like when you think, everyone hears about how the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Well, if you're on a sphere, is that line straight anymore? Yeah, that's right. And if you're in a space that's shaped a different way, like how about light? Ever watch light go into water? And it looks like it bends, which it does. It changes to, well, is that a straight line? No, but it's the least time to get to that point. So light picks the least time. Well, how does it do this? So it gives you a hint. We have these clues which you can observe with your senses, but you're required to use your mind to figure out why your senses are in contradiction with each other, which is what Kepler did, and why your senses seem to contradict the things that you thought you knew, like that the shortest distance between 2 points is one straight line and there's only one of them. So you're not going to understand the universe if you rely on this. You will never be able to make a scientific discovery of principle. And 3, a mistaken faith in the existence of simple time. That is, the time always moves at a certain pace, and things always go at a certain pace, and there's before and after, and before has a linear direct effect on the after, and things don't affect the present doesn't affect the history, and the future doesn't affect history, right? The time is just a linear construct. And this also is not true. It's not true. It's not even physically true in the universe. And then he says the 4th, nominally transcendental step in that ordering is defined at an appropriate point below. And he brings it up later, which is the distinction between mind and brain. And I'll just say there was an interesting discussion on this question in our basement team because it's very fascinating. People who study the brain, and everybody's heard these theories which seem to have some relationship to empirical data, that certain parts of your brain, certain areas of your brain control certain functions. And that seems to work because they measure waves of activity from that part of the brain when you're moving your left hand or whatever it is. But it turns out that when someone has a brain injury, that other parts of the brain can begin to take care of the function of the injured part of the brain. It's called brain plasticity. Now, what is the cause of that? Well, that might be the mind. The brain, the physical brain is injured, but your mind is able to change the function of your brain. It's a very exciting idea with a lot of implications. Now, what I wanted to do as a big challenge is Shelley, because one of the questions about about truth. If you think of an idea, and it's the same problem with mathematics with regard to physics, if you're trying to express an idea, can you express exactly what you mean in words? Or is it that you have an idea and you use the words and they're sort of like a skeleton, and then the mind of the person that you're speaking with reforms the idea in their own mind? So what you're trying to do with language is you want to convey an idea which is not itself in the words, but you use the words to allow the person with whom you're having this dialogue to create their own idea. And that's when you know when you understand. Like sometimes you hear what someone's saying, you say, I don't understand. And they say, I said it's right here. And you say, I know, I heard the words, but I don't understand what you're meaning, right? So there's something beyond the words. And the key in poetry, which is phenomenally exciting, is the question that often in a really great poem, by the words actually not making sense in the literal sense, you are allowed to apprehend a very profound idea which is profoundly true but cannot be expressed in the words. And I wanted to look at, we're going to look at a couple sections of it first, and then we're going to listen to a recitation of Shelley's poem, Ode to a Skylark, which people may know, but even just the beginning, yeah, you can put that on the screen. Is it in there?
Sure.
Oh, it's going to start playing? Then never mind, don't do it until, you cannot do it. Yeah, I'll just read the parts I want.
Okay,
Stop. No. Okay. All right, anyway, the way it starts, you can see, Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Now, I can't help it. Every time I hear this, I get an image of a bird singing from heaven. I always get that image, and the first thing he says is, bird thou never wert. Well, what is it? Well, it's not a bird, but it's somehow in heaven, and it has a heart, supposedly, which is full, and it's full of unpremeditated art, and it's somehow sharing that. But it's not a bird. It doesn't, it's a spirit. It's a spirit. And then higher still and higher, from the earth thou springest like a cloud of fire. A cloud of fire. What is a cloud of fire? Isn't a cloud dark, gray, blocks out light? How can you have a cloud of fire? The blue deep thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. So he's talking about wings, but he already said it wasn't a bird. Okay? And there's, listen to this. The pale purple even melts around thy flight like a star of heaven in the broad daylight. Who has seen a star when it's high noon? And he says, thou art unseen, but yet I hear thy shrill delight. Listen to this. All the earth and air with thy voices loud, as when night is bare, from one lonely cloud the moon rains out her beams, and heaven is overflowed. Again, a cloud. And then somehow you have beams coming out of a cloud. And then there's one that I really, really love, which is, yeah. Here it is, listen to this. Try and imagine this one. Sound of vernal showers on the twinkling grass. Has anyone ever heard rain landing on grass? Sound of vernal showers on the twinkling grass. Rain awakened flowers. All that ever and clear and fresh, thy music doth surpass.
You can't hear any of those things.
No, you can't hear any of them, but he's talking about the music. Now, can you have music without sound, without hearing? Teach us, sprite or bird, what sweet thoughts are thine. I have never heard praise of love or wine that panted forth a flood of rapture so divine. This is really this question. It's a complete turning inside out all of the ideas of your senses. Your mind is trying to give yourself an image, and he's giving you all these, they seem like amazing images, but then when you try to imagine them, when you try and recreate them in your mind, like twinkling grass, the sound of rain landing on the grass, or beams of the moon coming from a cloud, your mind gets a funny sort of ambiguity, and it's in this idea that the truth of what Shelley is getting at, because it's a question of inspiration. You've heard of inspiration, or the muse. Well, what is it? How do you describe it? So what I'm going to do, I found this recording, which I really like. It's I don't know, she might be a 15-year-old girl. And I listened, I went online and I found all these really horrible, horrible recordings of these stuffy old Brits who sounded like they might be in a tomb, reading it like they were dead. It was so dreadful. And then this was really refreshing. You'll hear she makes a couple of mistakes, but I want you to listen and think about this question of sense certainty and what Shelley is getting at.
To a Skylark, Percy Shelley, 1820. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, but from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Higher still and higher, from the earth thou springest like a cloud of fire. The blue deep thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. In the golden lightning of the sunken sun, o'er which clouds are brightening, thou dost float and run, like an unbodied joy whose race is just begun. The pale purple even melts around thy flight, like a star of heaven. In the broad daylight thou art unseen, but yet I hear thy shrill delight. Keen as are the arrows of that silver spear, Keen as are the arrows of that silver sphere, whose intense lamp narrows in the white dawn clear, until we hardly see, we feel that it is there. All the earth and air with thy voice is loud, as when the night is bare, from one lonely cloud the moon rains out her beams, and heaven is overflowed. What thou art we know not, what is most like thee? From rainbow clouds there flow not drops so bright to see, as from thy presence showers a rain of melody. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden, till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Like a high-born maiden in a palace tower, soothing her love-laden soul in secret hour with music sweet as love, which overflows her bower. Like a glowworm golden in a dell of dew, scattering unbeholden its aerial hue among the flowers and grass, which screen it from view. Like a rose embowered in its own green leaves, by warm winds deflowered till the scent it gives makes faint with too much sweet those heavy winged thieves. Sounds of vernal showers on the tinkling grass, rain-awakened flowers, all that ever was joyous and clear and fresh, thy music doth surpass. Teach us, sprite or bird, what sweet thoughts are thine. I have never heard praise of love or wine that panted forth a flood of rapture so divine. Chorus hymnal, or triumphal chant, matched with thine, would be all but an empty vaunt, a thing wherein we feel there is some hidden want. What objects are fountains of thy happy strain? What fields or waves or mountains? What shapes of sky or plain? What love of thine own kind? What ignorance of pain? With thy clear, keen joyance languor cannot be, shadow of annoyance never came to thee. Thou lovest, but ne'er know love's sad satiety. Waking or asleep, thou of death must deem things more true and deep than we mortals dream. Or how could thy notes flow in such a crystal stream? We look before and after, and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. Yet if we could scorn hate and pride and fear, if we were things born not to shed a tear, I know not how thy joy we ever should come near. Better than all measures of delightful sound, better than all treasures that in books are found, thy skilled poet were, thou scorner of the ground. Teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know. Such harmonious madness from my lips would flow, the world should listen to them, as I am listening now.
So can anyone draw a picture of this? But it's real. Everyone knows it's real because everyone has experienced this quality of inspiration. And I don't think any of us could probably do a better job of describing it than Shelley did in this poem, which in a sense tells you nothing. And I wanted actually here, LaRouche makes a point in the paper on this question of reductionism, where the idea is you take a principle which is true, and then you say, I'm going to break it down, I'm going to reduce it into parts. Now, if you think of trying to do that with this poem, what happens? It has wings. It's a bird. It's not a bird. It sings, but you can't hear it. Suddenly, if you take the parts, the thing makes no sense whatsoever, although it makes sense when it's a whole. And you get this in the organizing all the time. We say, Obama has to be removed from office. And people say, who is going to replace him? Well, who is going to replace him has nothing to do with it. That's not a principle, that's a thing. We're speaking from a principle. We will not survive unless this creature is put in a position, whether he's physically removed or removed from power in a way that people stick him in a rubber room and pretend that he's president, but they run the show, whatever it's done, like a nice impeachment vote, pretend to do that to him. So you're saying something from the standpoint of principle, and the response is, who do we put in his place? Who are you voting for in the next election? Is there someone better than it? None of these things have anything to do with the principle. And reductionism is a way of destroying your ability to think and to act in history, because in physics, just as there is no empty time and no empty space, and time is not this linear absolute construct, you cannot intervene on history from the standpoint of sense certainty. It will never work. And happily, every human being has a mind, as as opposed to just a brain. You have a mind, which means that each human being is capable of transforming history in the way that's required, provided you haven't been brainwashed by this sick culture that we're in. So next. You might be tempted to ask, what might be gained from those reflections? What must be gained is a clearer insight into the ontologically superior reality of the concept of the human mind as being the most fundamentally physical experience, as being expressed in the notion of the principle of the human mind itself, or in other words, the soul, rather than as an expression of the flesh, as the only real expression of the living human identity. And this also gets at why it's such an evil thing, these cost-effective people with Obama's health care, where they have this thing they call it quality of life. Well, is quality of life based on your mind? No, because as Obama said in that town hall meeting when the woman asked about her 104-year-old mother who had had a pacemaker put in at the age of 99 and was doing great, and what had happened was she called doctors and they didn't want to put a pacemaker in someone who was 99 years old. And her mother's doctor said, take her to see the people who do the pacemakers, because when they see her and they see her zest for living, they'll say, okay, we're going to do it. And they did it, and she was doing great, 6-7 years later. And Obama said, well, no, we could never take that into account because we have no way of measuring it. So we would just say, you're over a certain age, sorry, you don't get the treatment. Okay, that's this reductionism. That's brain versus mind. Totally, totally destructive, totally evil. Now, what's next? I forgot what I put next. Oh yeah, this is wonderful. This is what we're discussing. The most efficient distinction of the two states as they interact with varying degrees of relative intensity seem to express evidence to the effect that the difference is to be located as a sort of quarrel between a creative overbrain and a bestial, e.g. literal, underbrain, both inhabitants of a common, quote-unquote, normal human individual as distinct from the beasts. The challenge is typified by the conflict between the conceptions of J.S. Bach and the so-called popular music entertainment today. All right, and everyone can think of moments where you have conflicts. The biggest one is, and this is in when Christ is at Gethsemane, and people may remember that he asks his disciples to watch with him while he prays, and they fall asleep. Now, how many times have you felt an irresistible urge to fall asleep when you are supposed to be concentrating on something that's difficult? Or you run up against a really difficult problem, you say, I'm so tired. Okay. And that's this. That's your bestial underbrain trying to take possession of your overbrain, your mind. Okay, and it's the most clear one, and I love it that this is this thing with Christ, because it's just so clear. It's so useful because you can read it. I read it, many, many times, and then somehow, only in the last couple of years did I really say, oh, this is what he's getting at. This is what he's getting at. And you can catch yourself, you know it when you're going there. get to a thorny idea and you just want to go to sleep. Okay, that's the fight. That's the fight. Now, next, and this is the most maybe challenging part, and I have to say I don't fully understand this, but I'm going to use an example that I think helps us sort of get at this. This was a topic of discussion between Mr. LaRouche and the basement team, where he writes, in virtual waves of biological development, but in the same process, a process in its pioneering phase appears to shift somewhat to a lateral development. It appears that in some cases, as in economic progress, for example, development shifts toward development of a form of moving ahead by developing sideways rather than simply forward. The effect includes compound effects, which suggest that the process appears to have shifted, with the effect that the compound process proceeds backward in time effect, while forward movement slows relative to the branches of progress-based which locate progressive growth as being located to a relatively major degree on the growth of the relatively more primitive phase as a dominant feature of the process overall. This is notable in physical economic growth. Now that's tough, because he's talking about things occurring simultaneously where perhaps you don't get progress in the way that you think, but something happens off to the side, which then becomes crucial for the next development. And one of the things that they brought up was the question of mammals, that when you had the dinosaurs, you actually did have these little mammals, and they were very tiny, and there weren't that many of them, and it didn't really seem that being a mammal was a particular great advantage over being a reptile, over being a dinosaur. But then what happened is the conditions of our intergalactic travels caused the dinosaurs to go extinct. And then these little mammals, which were not that developed, suddenly flourished and became developed. And we can see now that being a mammal is greatly superior to being a reptile. It's more complex, and then somehow from these mammals you got to human beings, which are much beyond that because of this question of creativity. And it's interesting, I have to say right now, apparently a lot of the mammals are now going extinct. This is something the environmentalists want to blame on man-made climate change. But this is a natural part of the development of the planet. That whole, 80% of all species go extinct, and then new species which are more advanced emerge. Now, human beings are not animals, so we don't have to go extinct. But if we don't want to go extinct, we have to utilize that which distinguishes us from the animals, which is, as he said, our soul, our mind. Our mind, which has a physical effect in the physical universe, but you cannot see, touch, smell, taste, or detect it on any of the advanced instruments of measuring that we have. But that's the thing that is the distinction. Now, so this question of time, I was very struck, and what I want to end with is we're going to listen to a speech that President Kennedy gave on the opening of a dam. This was, I think, August of 1962, yeah. And it's about 16 minutes. And I want you to think about his perspective, because what you hear is he references over and over again Franklin Roosevelt and the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration. And And the REA was extremely controversial when FDR did it, because the monetarist, reductionist Wall Street argument was that it was too expensive to bring electricity to the countryside because the houses might be 40 miles apart. So it was okay to have electricity in the city where people were close together, but it was not cost effective to have 40 miles of wire. So one farmer, and God knows what his parents did, they might have been farmers before him, he probably didn't even own a suit, right? So some farmer with dirty hands and a stinky house that smelled like cows should be allowed to have electricity. And of course FDR knew that you transform the field and the whole population is up to a new platform of existence. So just think about this question and what LaRouche is saying about the present, the past, the future, lateral developments, and think about the way that Kennedy is addressing this in the speech, which really is it's remarkable.
Remarks of the President at dedication ceremonies of the Oahe Dam Project in Pierre, South Dakota, August 17, 1962.
Secretary Udall, our host, your distinguished governor, Governor Guy, and to recently my associate at the White House, George McGovern, Secretary Vance, members of the House and Senate, ladies and gentlemen. I want to express my great pleasure and to tell you what a privilege it is to leave Washington these days and come out here to South Dakota. And I can think of nothing more beneficial for those of us who work in Washington, in the nation's capital, to leave on occasions and come out and see the people of the United States. These dams, these great projects, frequently are statistics to those of us who work in the nation's capital. And I can imagine nothing more beneficial to any American, to any member of the House or Senate, to any member of the executive branch, to any citizen of this country, than to come here to South Dakota and realize here in this state and in this country there is being built the largest dam of its kind in the world. It is a source of pleasure to me as President, therefore, to come here on this occasion. And I think it's very beneficial for us to realize how frequently the American people have worked together to provide this kind of great benefit. We are 180 million different people with very different ideas on what we should do and how this country should be run and where we should go and what are our responsibilities and obligations. I think it is important that we recognize how often we work together to accomplish great results. And this Missouri River Basin Power System, these lights going on and off, bring to our attention the remarkable progress which we've made in one generation in this country in lighting the West, in bringing the benefits of science and technology to the people who live in this part of the United States. These are benefits which are made available to all American citizens. There could be no view of this country more erroneous than members of the Congress or of the executive or the citizens of different states to believe that what happens here in South Dakota is important only to the people of South Dakota and is a matter of indifference to the people of New England or California. I can imagine no better way than for this country to stand still if that should ever become our viewpoint and our mentality. What happens in this basin helps all the people of all the country. What happens in the east helps the west. What happens in the south helps the north. This country would not have achieved the highest standard of living in the world, the largest productive power, if we had been merely 180 million different people. Instead, free and independent, and yet willing to work together, we've accomplished this. And we're going to accomplish all the other great tasks that lie before us if we are to achieve our destiny. So I'm glad to be here. And I wish those who come and visit this country from abroad would come here. They come to New York and to Washington, and they feel they've seen America. They should come here, and to Montana, and to California, and to Boston, Massachusetts, and then they would see something of the United States. This dam will produce enough electric energy, this one dam, to light the city of Edinburgh in Scotland. This dam alone will supply enough irrigation area larger than the nation of Luxembourg. This dam and the rest of the dams on this river, which 30 years ago would have provided only floods and darkness, now provide irrigation and light. And though those of us who are here today follow in the footsteps of those who made it possible, we share a satisfaction and also a commitment that we must in our time make it easy for future presidents of the United States and future citizens in the 1970s and 80s to visit projects like this, which have been planned and carried out in our day. Water is our most precious asset, and its potential uses are so many and so vital that they are frequently in conflict. Power versus irrigation, irrigation versus navigation, navigation versus industrial, industrial versus recreational. Here in the Missouri Basin, the supply of water cannot meet all of these needs all the time. Accommodations are necessary. And in 1944, under the administration of President Roosevelt, a comprehensive Missouri Basin plan was authorized to accomplish all of these great objectives. This is the fifth of 6 great dams to control the main stream of the Missouri River. And I can assure those of you at the upper end of the Missouri and our good friends at the lower end that it will continue to be our policy to regulate the storage and the flow of water in these reservoirs in the most advantageous manner for all concerned that the best engineers in the world can devise. And I must say that I am heartened to come out here and talk to the distinguished engineer in charge and be informed by him that this has cost $25 million less than was estimated 8 years ago, and that stands as some kind of a record in the United States today. We're going to take him back to Washington and put him in charge of the whole operation. We take for granted these miracles of engineering, and too often we see no connection between this dam right out here and our nation's prosperity and our nation's security and our leadership all around the world. The facts of the matter are that this dam and many more like it are as essential to the expansion and growth of the American economy as any measure that the Congress is now considering. And this dam and others like it are as essential to our national strength and security as any military alliance or missile complex. When we are inclined to take these wonders for granted, let us remember that only a generation or two ago, all the great rivers of America, the Missouri, the Columbia, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, ran to the sea unharnessed and unchecked. Their power potential was wasted. Their economic benefits were sparse, and their flooding caused an appalling destruction of life and of property. Then the vision of Theodore Roosevelt was fulfilled by Franklin Roosevelt. And to demonstrate how important this is as a national issue, two distinguished American presidents from New York State saw how essential it was to the nation and New York State to develop the resources of the West. And as a result, this nation began to develop its rivers systematically, to conserve its soil and its water, and to channel the destructive force of these great rivers into light and peace. And today, as a result of this, the face of this nation has been changed. And forests are growing where there was once dirt and waste. And now there is prosperity where our poorest citizens once lived. If there is one outstanding story among all this, which indicates the kind of progress we can make working together, it's the story of the REA and of Sam Rabin of Texas and Franklin Roosevelt of New York and George Norris of Nebraska. Less than 30 years ago, in the lifetime of most of us here, as you know, fewer than 10% of all our rural homes in this country had electric power. Whenever I read about the statistics of desolation that are in the underdeveloped world in Latin America and all the rest, we should realize that less than 30 years ago, only 10% of our rural homes had electricity. That's how quickly the face of a nation can be changed, by determination and by cooperative action by all the people. And then a farmer had no opportunity to participate in the mainstream of American life, to use labor-saving machinery, nor did his wife. Did they have light or a telephone or a radio? Today, more than 95% of rural homes have electric power. The lives of these farmers and their families and their children have been enriched by living in the closest communion with the rest of our country. The REA co-ops and power districts, which have marketed this power, have been a happy middle ground between private enterprise and public cooperation. They are making the most of Theodore Roosevelt's principle that marketing agencies which represent all the people should be given a preference in the development of waters which belong to all the people. And I don't think the role of the REA is finished yet. The role of the REA isn't finished yet. And those who say that its job is finished, and the job really in so many ways of this country finished, are wrong. By the end of this century, we're going to have 300 million people and a $2 trillion national income, and a great responsibility as the food basket of a world which will double its population in the next 40 years. This is the prospect for the end of this century. And the key to this century is power. Power on the farm as well as the factory. Power in the country as well as the city. And the need for power on the farm and the countryside continues to grow. Electricity rates must remain low. More generating capacity must be developed. And soon the vast resources of nuclear energy will be tapped. This is not a choice between spending and saving, for REA is a form of saving, as is this dam, hours and lives, saving farms, and saving and returning to our nation's government every dollar loaned with interest, in taxes on new appliances and new equipment and new farm income. This program and so many like it have returned there to the public treasuries many times the entire cost of the program. The question which confronts us is related to the question which confronted Roosevelt and Rabin and Norris in the 30s. And that is the whole question of our resource development in the western United States in the 1960s. Our electric power needs will double in this decade. Our economic, military, and international commitments will require a continuing source of new energy. Surely a continent so rich in minerals, so blessed with water, and a society so replete with engineers and scientists can make and must make the best possible use of the bounty which nature and God have given us, public and private, federal and local, cooperative and corporate. We cannot prevent other people in this country from developing their resources. We look forward to the day when energy will flow where it's needed. We cannot permit railroads to prevent coal slurry pipelines from conveying the resources of our mines. We cannot permit the mining industries to say there shall be no nuclear energy because it may affect them adversely. We cannot permit as a country public and private power interests to veto each other's projects. Or if one region to permit another to say another region shall not develop. If we do that, we shall stand still and forget the lesson that our history has told us. But if we can apply to the challenges of the 60s the same principles of efficiency, cooperation, and foresight which made this great dam possible, the same principles which caused American technicians to be sought out the world over to assist in developing the Nile, the Volta, the Mekong, and the river, then we can look to a happy future. I am proud to come here today. This is a matter of the greatest importance to us as a country. This quick visit on conservation, I hope, will remind all of us in Washington that we have a good deal of unfinished business in this area. The Secretary of Interior, Mr. Udall, will visit the Soviet Union in September. He may see a dam nearing completion, which will be double the size of our largest, Grand Coulee. The dam at Bratsk on the Angara River in central Siberia, already partially producing power, will shortly back up a man-made island sea of 40 million acre-feet with a capacity of 4.5 million kilowatts. And the Grand Coulee, our largest, is 2 million kilowatts. I don't want to see the United States second in space or in the development of power resources. And I think it's most appropriate. I think it's most appropriate in this great decade that we light the entire country. I think our commitment is that expressed by a distinguished senator from my own state of Massachusetts, whose words are hung behind the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives. He said, "Let us develop the resources of our land, call forth its power, build up all its great institutions, and see whether we in our time and generation may not perform something worthy to be remembered." I'm proud of the engineers and of the citizens of this state who helped build this great dam.